Oh, Amnesty International released the report on Israel's actions in Gaza, and oh boy, there's a lot of data in there that is painting a difficult picture for Israel. And in today's video, I read the report. It's nearly 300 pages. And I'm going to summarize it for you to explain what is genocide, is Israel committing genocide, and what does this mean? Now, before I go into this, I just want to say that I think it's actually wrong to have it's not helpful to have this discussion. What I have seen in the past couple of months is that this debate about whether Israel has committed genocide or not takes away from what is actually happening, because genocide is these terms, apartheid, genocide, these are legal terms that have a specific definition. And so even if a party is killing 100,000 people, it doesn't mean genocide has occurred, because genocide has to fit in this particular specific definition, box of a definition. And so the debate becomes whether it fits in this definition or not, instead of what is actually, or kind of portraying what is actually happening on the ground, and how this impacts the people. So we kind of move away from, um, you know, what is actually happening to debating on whether it fits the definition. And so you see how this takes away from what is actually happening. And so I feel like it's a big trap, and therefore I don't like to use these words as genocide or apartheid, because we get lost into that discussion of, does it fit that exact specific particular definition or not, instead of debating whether this should continue or not. Anyways, in this episode, I'm going to go through that definition with you and discuss what are the findings of Amnesty International, and what my thoughts are about this. So let's start off with the definition of genocide. Genocide is defined under the Genocide Convention. A lot of states have agreed to that definition, Israel included. And so in the present convention, genocide means any of the following acts committed with the intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethical, racial, or religious group. As such, these are the actions that would be considered as genocide: killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to the members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. So this is different to killing members of the group. This is kind of inflicting or creating a situation that will lead to the destruction. It doesn't have to result in the destruction, but if this continued, it would have led to the destruction of that group in whole or in part, as in like either or the whole group or some part of that group. Number 4 is imposing measures intended to prevent births within this group. And number 5, forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. These are the 5 actions that would be considered as genocide. Now, this is where it gets tricky, because not only do we need to see one of these 5 things, doesn't have to be all of them, but as important is for any action to qualify as a genocide, there must be specific intent to destroy the group, not just harm the individuals. There has to be an actual intent to destroy this group in whole or in part. And that's very challenging to prove, this intent, because states don't go out and say, we intend to genocide this group, right? You don't find that in any situation. So how do you prove that they had an intention, a specific intention to do that? And that's what makes it different to war crimes or crimes against humanity. That's what makes genocide different. So what do the courts do? The courts typically will look at the patterns of conduct and the kind of evidence available. So for example, in past cases like the Rwanda case, which the UN created these tribunals for, they looked at, when you look at those actions that those parties carried out, does it infer intent? Does it show intent? Is there any question about whether they carried out these activities because of some other objective, or does it clearly show and infer that there is intent? So they'll look at kind of like the systematic killings targeting these specific groups, the public statements that these people made before attacking and during attacking these groups, and actions where it's very clear that survival becomes near impossible or impossible. such as starvation and forcibly, moving people. This is what I've seen online that has caused the biggest debate, which is that a lot of the people against this report are arguing that Amnesty International decided to change the definition of what genocide means, but that's not really correct. Now, this is where this comes from. You know, uh, in terms of the intent that we just spoke about, the ICJ held that in order to infer the existence of dolus specialis, this is from the Amnesty International report. Dolus specialis means like that specific intent that's required in genocide. The existence of dolus specialis from a pattern of conduct, it is necessary and sufficient that this is the only inference that could reasonably be drawn from the act in question, meaning that the intent to destroy the group in whole or in part must be the only reasonable inference which can be drawn from the pattern of the conduct. What this is saying is that in this case that the ICJ looked at, which is the Croatia genocide, the Croatia-Serbia case, their definition of intent was that it has to be, when you look at what happened, there could be no other reason why they did what they did other than to kill, to destroy, not just to harm, to destroy the people in that group of people in part or in whole. What Amnesty International is saying is that this is a ridiculous standard because in war, if something happens in war, that means there can be no genocide because if you get attacked, you could cause genocide, but legally it will not be considered genocide because you have other objectives, i.e., you could have a military objective, but as a secondary objective, you might have genocide. But because you have a primary military objective, any action will not be seen as only intended to destroy the group because there's a military objective there. And so they're saying, in that case, the ICJ was incorrect. And to support that, there are other cases that, for example, there was UN tribunals with respect to the Rwanda case, respect to Bosnia case, whereby the definition of specific intent wasn't just the only reasonable inference point that they're making over here. It could be a secondary objective, i.e., as it happens in any armed conflict, there's going to be a primary military objective, but even if there's a secondary objective of intent to destroy a group in whole or in part, that could still lead to genocide. And so there's this kind of like, how do you interpret specific intent? In that case, the ICJ looked at it, interpreted in a specific way, which is it has to be the only reasonable inference. In other cases, like the Rwanda case, it could be a secondary objective to destroy the group. It doesn't have to be the only exclusive objective. And I mean, common sense says that if we take the ICJ as interpretation, that means any armed conflict is not going to result in genocide because if there's a military objective, then that removes the genocide thing completely, which I think is incorrect, really. And a lot of judges looked at the ICJ case and said that is incorrect, and they go through that in the Amnesty report. Now, before we go into what actually happened, Amnesty was clear that they tried to get access to Gaza, and that was denied by Israel. And that's one of the, I guess, weaknesses of this is that they had to rely on agents on the ground that were supporting them, but they wanted to send more people. Amnesty International wanted to send more people to Gaza, but because Israel's controlling Gaza, Israel denied access to Gaza. At the same time, Amnesty International sent a lot of their evidence and their findings to different Israeli organizations to receive comments, but either there was no replies from these Israeli organizations or departments, or there was just minimal acknowledgement, but without providing any evidence. And so Amnesty International tried to engage the Israeli government or departments, but there was no engagement from the other side. And before I go into, the other side, Hamas, it's not really an argument or a debate whether Hamas committed genocide or crimes against humanity. It's very clearly that they did. And Amnesty acknowledges that and actually details some of that, but they're going to create a separate report specifically on Hamas. And so it's out of scope of this discussion, really. Now, before we go into the situation, we have to provide some context about Gaza, because Gaza is one of the most densely populated areas in the world with over 2 million people. And the crazy thing about those 2 million people is half of them are under the age of 19. So most of them are young. And Israel maintains very strict control over Gaza. This is before 7 of October. They control the border, they control the economy, and they control movement since 2007. Now, what you'll hear a lot of the times is that Israel left Gaza in 2006. They had settlements, they moved their people out of Gaza, and the military left Gaza. But given that we're talking about definitions, there's a specific definition of an occupying force. It's not just military presence, it's effective control over an area. So there's a question of, does Israel actually occupy Gaza? This is before 7 October. Obviously, it occupies it now. Because when an occupying force or a force occupies a place, it has certain responsibilities under international law. And so Amnesty International approached this from two different angles. One, what is Israel's responsibilities as an occupying force? And what is Israel's responsibilities as a party to the armed conflict that's happening in that country? And the conclusion by international law and by many organizations is that Israel is occupying Gaza before 7 of October, even though it left Gaza militarily in 2006-7. That's because Israel controls the borders. It controls Gaza's airspace, sea access, and every land crossing except one crossing, which is between Egypt and Gaza. It controls the economy because it controls what is allowed to be imported into Gaza and what's allowed to be exported out of Gaza. That's controlled by Israel. And the financial systems are heavily restricted by Israel. Now, obviously, there is Egypt, but Egypt follows what Israel wants. That's the agreement that Egypt had with Israel. So even though there's one crossing near Rafah between Egypt and to Gaza, all other crossings are between Israel and Gaza, and they control what is allowed in and out. Now, here's the thing. Israel doesn't allow a lot of things that can be considered as dual use, i.e. use for military equipment that might not be needed for military equipment, might be needed for other things, but it won't allow it inside Gaza. So it completely restricts the importation, and it decides what is allowed to be imported in. And number three is Israel regularly conducts military operations within Gaza. We've seen that throughout the years. Number four, it controls population movement. Israel is actually the one who decides who and what can enter or leave Gaza, including the humanitarian aid. That was before 7 October. And because Israel is the occupying force, i.e. it has effective control over the area, it might not be inside Gaza before 7 October, but it controls it, really. And you might say it needs to control because of security reasons. Nevertheless, it has effective control. And therefore, it's considered as occupying force under international law, and it has obligations to provide basic necessities, medical necessities, food, and other obligations. Before 7 October 2023, 80% of Gaza's population relied on humanitarian aid. And the reason why that is because of the restrictions that Israel has imposed on Gaza. So what did Amnesty International find? They actually said that genocide happened because of three actions. Remember we identified 5 actions that can lead to genocide? Well, they focused on 3 of them. And they are killing members of a group, they are causing serious bodily harm or mental harm, and actions that are intending to create conditions of life calculated to bring about the physical destruction of that group. Let's go through each one of them. So, killing members of the group. Remember, it's not just that, it requires also the intent, specific intent to destroy the group along with the members of the group. And we said that it could have dual objectives. It can have a military objective, but also an intent to destroy that group, which is hard to prove, right? So number one, killing members of the group. They looked at the airstrikes that Israel carried out. And they documented many airstrikes, but they focused on 15. And just to kind of clarify, the report that they created, their scope of timeline was from 7 of October to around June of 2024. So from 7 October 2023 to around June of 2024. But they looked at 15 Israeli airstrikes between October 2023 and April 2024 that killed at least 334 civilians, including 141 children. And these airstrikes targeted homes that doesn't appear to have any apparent military objectives, which led them to conclude that there were deliberate attacks on civilians. Those attacks were carried out in the middle of the night, which means that the Israelis were expecting people to be asleep. And so they wouldn't be able to give them enough time for evacuation for the civilians. They sent people to look at um, the actual aftermath of those attacks, and there was no evidence of anything to do with military objectives. And Amnesty International reached out to the Israelis to ask them what was the military objective, and the Israelis would not be able to, well, did not provide any information on that and said they were going to investigate it. Amnesty International actually had people on the ground, their field workers, who were on the ground from before 7 October, go to those places, look at the rubble, speak to the people. And they found that there were no military objectives. The houses were not linked to Hamas. There was no military equipment that was found. And so the fact that there was no military objective, they concluded that there was no other intention than to kill those civilians. Some of those equipments, those ammunition used by the Israeli military were explosives with very wide area effects that cannot be directed at just specific military objectives, especially when you have a densely populated area, i.e. the effects cannot be limited. That would result in the military objects, civilians and civilian objects being struck without distinction. You're dropping these heavy weapons in these densely populated areas, which are even more densely populated than usual because you have people, because of the evacuation order, being put into families living with each other more and more than before. And so when you drop these big bombs in the middle of the night, they're so big, they're not really supposed to be used in urban warfare, in densely populated area. They're not prohibited by law, but you cannot say you're making a distinction between civilians and military objectives if you're using these weapons in these densely populated areas. So there is an intent to destroy part of the group. You have that intention. And Israel is one of the most technologically advanced countries, especially when it comes to their military. They have the capability to use weaponry that is more specific, but they're choosing not to. Not only are they choosing not to, for a lot of these attacks, there was no evidence of any military objective. There wasn't any firing coming across. They couldn't find any ammunition being stored. And so it was just civilians dying with no military objective, is the conclusion that's being made by Amnesty. And therefore, there's a deliberate, specific intent to kill or destroy a group, is their argument. But the biggest case that they made, because they have just so much data on this, is the deliberate act of inflicting conditions of life calculated to bring about the physical destruction of the group. And they break it down, and this is one of the 5 things that is the definition of genocide from an action perspective. They break it down into the destruction of infrastructure, and we'll go into these things in a bit more detail, forced displacement, blocking humanitarian aid, and the control over life-sustaining resources, or the destruction of life-sustaining resources. Now, let's start off with the destruction of infrastructure. I don't think people fully understand the extent of the destruction in the first 3 months of that war. During October, November, and December to the beginning of Jan, the destruction is like we've never seen in a war before. And just to give you an example of what we're talking about, and this is one of the reasons why they see that there was an actual specific intent to destroy the group by inflicting these conditions of life that will lead to the physical destruction of the group. Remember, it doesn't have to actually result. We don't have to wait and see the destruction of the group to say that it will lead to the destruction. You have to, when looking at the facts and looking at the data, conclude that there is no way that this will not lead to the destruction. And if you could do that, then that will be considered as genocide, because genocide does not have to mean the actual killing and massacre of people. It's creating these conditions that will lead to a lot of people dying, even if it's a slow death. Right? The amount that the attacks that they carried out on essential infrastructure, like homes, hospitals, the energy sector, and the sanitation system, were insane. Now, about 62% of all homes in Gaza, right, which equate to more than 290,000 units, were damaged or destroyed by January 2024. Remember, this started on the 7th of October, 2024. In less than 3 months, more than 60% of homes were destroyed, which equates to nearly more than 1 million people. More than 1 million people were impacted by these destructions of these homes. Now, the argument is, well, they had to. If Hamas is fighting from those homes, then it's understandable that they would need to attack it, because a home becomes a military complex or place once there is an active operation happening from there. But think about the number, 290,000 units. That means if every house unit had one Hamas member, there would be 290,000 Hamas members that should have been killed by January of 2024, which is ridiculous. Of course, that didn't happen, which means that they were destroying houses when there was not military objective. There has to be houses because of the sheer amount of number of houses involved in this. Either they were using weapons that were unnecessary, that destroyed many houses in one go, or they were targeting houses that did not have military objectives, that didn't have any military activity. Now, on top of that, nearly 84% of health facility buildings, 84 health facility buildings, and 57% of the water infrastructure were damaged or destroyed. And a couple months in, CNN, this is by January, remember, we're still talking about the first 3 months. CNN reported that 20 of the 22 hospitals in northern Gaza have been destroyed or damaged between 7 October and 7 December, in 2 months only. And when they looked at the craters, near the craters near 11 of those hospitals, they were consistent with those craters that are left by 2,000-pound bombs. These 2,000-pound bombs, which there has been a lot of evidence that Israel were using those 2,000-pound bombs. They are huge. They create huge craters. It's impossible to say that they are targeting only military objectives, unless you're dropping them where there's an army. There's like a battle happening, and you drop them, and it destroys the people. But if we're talking about very densely populated areas where civilians are everywhere, and you've told them to go into these areas, and you're dropping these 2,000-pound bombs. Sometimes you did tell them to evacuate, right? In northern Gaza, they did tell them to evacuate, but some people could not evacuate. Obviously, there's a lot of people that could not leave the hospital because they're on medication that they cannot leave, or they're on some kind of system. So they were dropping these 2,000 bombs near these hospitals or at these hospitals. More than 60% of the electricity distribution network was damaged or destroyed. And this is the crazy part, is that they found that a lot of homes that were destroyed were not actually destroyed during fighting. They were destroyed to create these buffer zones, which means the houses didn't need to be destroyed because there was no military objective. Not only houses, they found schools, they found hospitals, they found religious, not hospitals, but medical buildings, and they found religious, like mosques, in this buffer zone that Israel was creating, that was demolished intentionally by the IDF when there was no, it was secured by Israel, i.e. there was no military operations happening in that area. And that also included agricultural land. The third was the forced displacement. This is one of the third. The third was the forced displacement, as one of the things that was creating these environments that brought about the destruction, or will bring about the physical destruction of the group of people, in part or in whole. There was repeated evacuation orders, right? Which displaced 90% of the population, 90% of the population. And they were all put into these overcrowded, unsanitary conditions that exacerbated health and the survival issues. Evacuation orders had internally placed 1.9 million people, and 90%, which is 90% of the population, they were evacuated at least once by early July 2024. So everyone nearly was evacuated. The issue that they made, the point that they're making, Amnesty International, is that after areas were secured by Israel, those people were not told to go back to their homes, which means Israel was kind of creating this permanent displacement, really. There were areas that Israel isn't going to allow the Palestinians to go back to because those areas were secured months before. And until this day, all the Palestinians are grouped into all these kind of very congested areas unnecessarily, which is creating conditions that will lead to their death because there is no electricity, there is no water, clean water. Very little food was entering, especially during the first 3-4 months, and we'll go into that. And this was done on purpose. Israel knows that Gaza's population is dependent on external entry of goods to allow them to survive because of previous conditions being set by Israel, which controls the borders of Gaza. And so it was very easily to conclude that this will lead to the destruction of this group when this continues. And so when people argue, well, hang on, we're not seeing, the hundreds of thousands of people dead that you would expect from massacres. Again, that's not really the definition of genocide. If is it creating conditions that's going to lead to destruction of those people, and is there a specific intention to destroy that group, not just to harm them, but to destroy them, i.e., it doesn't have to have destroyed them, it will lead to the destruction, even if it's a slow death destruction. The next one is the blocking of humanitarian aid. Now, this is a huge one because 80% of Gaza was dependent on humanitarian aid before 7 of October. Now, why would you say? It's very weird that 80% of the population is dependent on humanitarian aid. That's because there's a lot of restrictions of what is allowed to enter Gaza. And so there's a lot of things that Gazans cannot produce because they need certain equipment or certain things that Israel defines as or categorizes as dual use, i.e., it can be used for military objectives, and therefore it's not allowed to enter Gaza. And therefore, Gazans are reliant on entry of humanitarian aid for them to survive. 80% are dependent on humanitarian aid. Now, the point that they make is that even when some aid was allowed to enter, the restrictions were so stringent as to render them insufficient and leading to conditions that cause slow death through starvation, through malnutrition, and through disease. And so there's a lot of examples of where, Benjamin Netanyahu said that the amount of aid that's coming in is equal to 3,000 calories per person every day. Well, they're not looking at, there are times where this happened. For example, after 6 months of the war, there was aid coming in that equated to that. And so they're using kind of certain small periods of time where aid flowed in to tell the story of how much calories per day was given to the Gazans, and making the assumption that this was all across the war. But let's look at the data of the aid, because this is a big one for the ICC case, where they issued the warrants for Netanyahu, and also for this genocide case. And I'm going to read you these things. Oxfam described Israel's cutting of northern Gaza as a siege within a siege. It was reported that between 1st of Jan and 12th of February 2024, Israel denied permission to over 50% of humanitarian requests to access the north. These humanitarian agencies kept on requesting access to provide certain equipment, shelter, all these different things, and it was denied by Israel. Now, here's the key thing. 44% of the food consumption in Gaza's households was met through domestic agricultural products, with the remaining 56% originating from imports. Now, because the military destroyed the agriculture in Gaza, now they were pretty much dependent completely on imports coming in for food. Now, OCHA, which is an Israeli organization, noted that there was about 100 food trucks coming into Gaza before 7 of October. 75 of those food trucks were in relation to actual food for people, and 25 of those food trucks were livestock and animal feeders, so they're food for animals. So about 75 trucks per day were entering Gaza for food to sustain the population. That was during a time when 40% of Gaza's food was done domestically. After the war, that food that was produced domestically was gone. So they needed about double basically of the importation of food from before. So instead of 75, they needed about 150. Let's say they needed about 100. Let's say 100 they needed to sustain, to survive, basically. Not to live well, to survive. 100 trucks. Before they needed 75. After the war, because of the domestic production gone to zero because of Israel destroying the agriculture and the war that happened, there was zero production, and so they relied only on imports of food. So the need goes from 75 food trucks to 100 food trucks per day. And I'm going to show you the actual data every month, what the food trucks were. This is the data from UNRWA and COGAT, which is the Israeli organization which organizes the humanitarian aid. This is not, so this, what this shows is food trucks entering on average per day in each of the months. You don't add those bars together. They're just the data from different data sources. So in October, the UNRWA estimated that there were five, well, not estimated, but said that there were 5 food trucks coming per day on average, while COGAT said there's 4. Now, remember, we said before the war, there was 75 food trucks for food for people coming in. And even if you wanted to hit that 75, in October, there was 5 food trucks. 5. I'm going to go with the UNRWA because we don't want to, the other one is 4, which is the Israeli organization saying 4. Now, you could say, okay, fine, there was a war happening. It was a lot of confusion on the 7th of October. After 3 weeks, let's give Israel, right, the benefit of the doubt. November, surely things will change. 45 food trucks were entering in November per day, when before the war it was 75. In December, it was 64 or 57. And only in June does it go back to what more than it was before. But remember, Gaza before used to have 40% of its food from domestic production, which is completely gone because of the war. So even the 94 is questionable whether that's enough for the 2 million, more than 2 million population that exists there. And in February, it goes down. In March and April, we see the highest number of food deliveries. And then in May and June, the UNRWA figures drop and the COGAT figures increase. And Amnesty International actually showcases that the reason why this happens is because COGAT doesn't just look at humanitarian aid, they look at commercial food trucks. And 50% of those trucks coming in that COGAT is registering are commercial, i.e., the food that's coming in from those trucks are being sold. They're not humanitarian aid. And so only the people that can afford the crazy prices that Gaza was seeing were able to obtain access to this food. And so majority of people could not. And so for May and June, we actually saw a decrease. And the argument that they're making is that, okay, you stopped providing electricity to Gaza. And remember, Gaza was dependent on Israel for electricity because Israel would not allow certain material and equipment to go into Gaza so they can rely on themselves to produce the energy that they need, because they considered some of these equipment as dual use for military objectives. So because Israel controlled the borders, they not allowed it to enter. So Gaza was reliant on Israel for its electricity need. They bombed the electricity, they bombed the water sanitation, they bombed the energy sector, the telecommunications sector, the hospitals. They destroyed 60% of homes in less than 3 months. They put people all in groups in conditions that will 100% lead to the destruction of a part of this group. And they weren't allowing those people to go back to their homes after they secured those areas. They were dropping these big bombs that were unnecessary given how densely populated those areas were. When they gave evacuation orders to some people, they didn't give it in time, or no evacuations were given to some homes, and they were destroyed. So combining the actions that they were taking, especially when it comes to the humanitarian aid, because the humanitarian aid, they had complete control over the humanitarian aid. It was only them that said yes or no. And they said no to humanitarian aid for such a long period of time. Remember, they are the occupying force before 7 October. So they had the obligation to make sure that there is enough food and sanitation and the right equipment and people have access to medical services as the occupying force. That's the obligation that they have. Even though they were not military there, they had effective control over Gaza, and they didn't provide that. Not only did they not provide it, they didn't allow for other humanitarian agencies to provide those things. And when they allowed aid to come in, it went through a rigorous process of checks, where some trucks would have to go through hours and hours of procedures that made it very difficult for aid to reach to people at the right time. And even when it reached the south, for example, it couldn't reach the north because the north was completely besieged. And they came out and said, we're going to siege the north. And the U.S. said, you cannot do that. It's illegal. We're going to stop providing you weapons if you continue doing that. So even the U.S., looking at kind of the intelligence that they had, were saying you're doing way too much in terms of the siege. It's becoming illegal. You guys need to change immediately right now. Otherwise, we don't want to be involved and complicit in the actions that you're taking. And a lot of times when they talk about the aid that entered, they talk about aid that entered after July, which they seem to have really allowed aid to come in for a lot of things, not everything, of course. Now, when you combine those actions with what they said during, especially at the beginning, such as we're not going to treat anyone as civilians, we're going to treat them as animals, no more water, no more electricity, no more food, we're going to besiege everyone. They made those declarations, and they made many declarations, which is in the Amnesty report. Combine that with the actions, it seems like they're concluding that there is a specific intent to destroy whole or in part this group. Yes, there is a military objective there, but also on top of it, you cannot conclude when you look at the fact that they're using these 2,000-pound bombs in densely populated areas, denying humanitarian aid for months and months and months in a population that is reliant on aid from the beginning, which is unprecedented in terms of military warfare. You don't have a situation where in the first 3 months, 90 or 60% of homes are destroyed. Hospitals are destroyed. They're destroyed even, the mosque, the medical places, the homes were destroyed, not even during military activities. It was after they secured the areas, they wanted to make these buffer zones. And so they just bulldozed a lot of these places. They destroyed the agriculture. And it happened so quick. And such kind of massive effect on the whole of the country. Because remember, like in any other country, usually the country is big enough where even if it's kind of besieged, it could rely on itself to some extent, especially when it comes to food, because they could produce food. Usually countries are able to produce food, but when you have a big, huge population and it's completely bordered and nothing's allowed to go in and out for many years, a lot of things were not allowed to go in and out. And so there was already a situation whereby the population was reliant 80% on humanitarian aid, not food-wise. Food-wise, 60%, I think 50 or 60%, 55% was on food was reliant on imports. You already have a terrible situation, and the Israelis knew about the situations. They knew that denying aid, what that would lead to. And so they're saying you cannot conclude that this was not an intention to destroy the group, because they knew if this continued, it will lead to the destruction of a whole or part of the group. And only after so much pressure from international agencies and international community, and even from the US, their biggest ally, did they start opening aid. And even when they allowed the aid in, they made it trickle very slowly in, and they allowed certain things in, but not other things. And so the conditions were there to really destroy that group. I'd love to hear your thoughts about this. If you did like this analysis, do like and subscribe, but also put in the comments whether you think this is genocide or not. And if you think there's anything missing. Thank you.